What in God's name is going on? Everybody is entering this fray who has a tittle of concern for human rights, from Amnesty International to Human Rights Watch, to endless numbers of human rights organizations, to many of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgendered organizations on the ground who are concerned, and even governments, my government, Canada, today on the record, opposing this kind of legislation, and the United States and Sarkozy of France. Where is the United Nations? Thank you. Just a footnote, you don't applaud at press conferences. It offends the media.
Okay. Thanks, Stephen, for making me rewrite what I was going to say, because you told me what to say. So which is really good, because I'm Basil Williams, and I'm from the Caribbean HIV/AIDS Alliance. Our role in the region is about ensuring that vulnerable populations have access to effective treatment, care, and support, reducing the effect of last night. And it actually moved me to the point of wanting to smash my laptop and all sort of things, just because of the horror that it puts out. But given the fact that over half of the world HIV/AIDS population live in Commonwealth countries, given the fact that there is a clear commitment from Commonwealth countries to protect the fundamental basis of human rights and justice, and for people to be able to live in a world where we regard self-determination as important, this bill become even more horrific. Given the fact that there have been numerous calls in terms from human watch groups on law reforms, which aims at reducing the effect of negative legislation, but still continues to discriminate against people living with HIV and AIDS. And given the fact that we know now that there's a growing knowledge of the need to involve people living with HIV and AIDS, vulnerable population, in the development of effective strategy to these response, despite all of these facts, there remains in place, as Stephen has said, there remains in place in most Commonwealth countries legislation that continues to discriminate against homosexual, as the bill sets out, against people living with HIV and AIDS, and against vulnerable population. And this goes very clearly against much of the principles that the Commonwealth is built on the fabric of democratic society that we live in. The private member's bill from Uganda is an offense, and we should be working with Commonwealth nations to ensure that if this bill is successful, then the Commonwealth take harsh decisions in suspending the membership of Uganda from the Commonwealth. And that seems to me would be a fundamental position that all decent people need to maintain. This bill, in its content, legalizes the murder of people living with HIV and AIDS. It legalizes it damages our work, our collective work, in terms of ensuring universal access to people living with HIV and AIDS. And worse than that, it sends a clear message that it may be acceptable to violate human rights. And if the Commonwealth nations do nothing about that, then they condone the act that this bill is perpetuating. We therefore asking that the government of Uganda make a very, very clear statement of its intention, of whether it intends to support this bill. And if it intends to support the bill, then I think, and I would hope, that the noises that we would hear at the Heads of Government Conference will be for there to be clear and decisive movement against Uganda in relation to this particular bill. But for me in particular, this is a wake-up call. This is a wake-up call for many of the Caribbean governments who continue to maintain on their statute book the buggery laws in all but I believe one, if I'm right, one country in the Caribbean. This is a wake-up call for many, many years of inaction. And now there needs to be a time where action is taken across the Caribbean so that we do not see a progression from Uganda to other countries of the Commonwealth, and we do not witness a further marginalization and discrimination of MSM, sex workers, people living with HIV and AIDS, and homosexual. In my view, the worst thing that we could do today is actually take no decisive action. Because again, as I said earlier, this will send the wrong message to, in particular, where this conference is taking place in the Caribbean region, not to do anything about the draconian laws that they've had on their statute book for many, many decades. Thank you.
My name is Robert Carr. I'm the Executive Director of the Caribbean Vulnerable Communities Coalition, which is a pan-Caribbean coalition of frontline service organizations working with most at-risk groups, so for sex workers, gay, bisexual, and other men who have sex with men, drug users, prisoners, and so on. For my own remarks, I absolutely agree with everything that Basil and Stephen have said. But I want to raise questions from a different angle, which is this bill from Uganda is clearly horrific, and anyone with, as both Stephen and Basil have said, anyone with a shred of decency who reads it can only be horrified at the way in which it legislates the death penalty for this group. It legislates for parents to betray their children within 24 hours, for neighbors to spy on each other and betray neighbors in 24 hours. It's genuinely horrific. But it seems to me that it's an extreme manifestation that does need to be denounced at this meeting. I think the threat of expulsion from the Commonwealth is something that the Commonwealth has an obligation to put on the table if this bill goes through. But I think it's also the result of many years of erosion of respect for basic decency for the people of the Commonwealth themselves. And this is something that I think is across the Commonwealth, certainly in Africa, certainly in the Caribbean. I'm less certain for Asia. But over the years, there has been this erosion of the notion that respect for human dignity and the idea that people in the Commonwealth are not meant to be included in principles of human decency has been gaining momentum on the floors of Parliament. And it's been happening in the Caribbean as parliaments have debated sexual offences acts, as they've debated family law acts. It's been happening in Africa as well. And it's been happening to an extent as well in Asia. And what we've seen is that the turn that these debates have taken is that they have begun to assume this very punitive tone where they have tried to identify criminals who are somehow exempt from the basic rights of decency and citizenship, and then to codify that expulsion into laws and into the legislation that is then passed. And we've seen extreme examples from the floor in Trinidad and in Jamaica, I know off the top of my head. Now, what's peculiar to me about this is that this really flies against our history in the Commonwealth. All of us, by virtue of being in the Commonwealth, come from a history of colonialism, colonial invasion, exploitation, abuse at the hands of security forces, deliberate strategies to keep us ignorant by not having effective primary education, undermining our health by not having effective primary healthcare systems. We've all struggled with anti-slavery struggles, with anti-colonialism, with anti-racism, yet somehow we have gotten to the place where on the floors of Parliament, those very same hateful attitudes that say that entire categories of people ought to be exempted from things that we take for granted in civilized societies is an appropriate way for parliaments to succeed. So it means, I think, that what we've got is an erosion of the basic principles of governance, of what is the role of politicians, what is the role of parliaments, how should legislation be structured, on what values and principles can you make statements from the floor of Parliament, can you craft legislation, and that, I think, is what has come to a crisis in Uganda. But it's a crisis in Uganda, but I think it's also happening, as I said, across the Caribbean and across Africa. And this, I think, is a fundamental challenge for CHOGM and for the Commonwealth as a whole, for all of the ministers' fora, as well as domestic politics, is how can we refine that place where we are rooted